Has the very soul of the Church ever been fractured by a single, agonizing decision? The first rays of sunlight crept over the rooftops of Rome and filtered gently through the stained glass dome of St. Peter's Basilica. In the early stillness, the light splashed softly across the marble floor, like the tender strokes of a painter who knew sorrow. The bells had not yet rung. The pigeons had not yet stirred. It was the kind of morning when even the air seemed to whisper instead of breathe. Inside the papal residence, all was silent, except for the quiet, almost imperceptible rhythm of an old man's heart. Pope Leo XIV, the aged shepherd of the Catholic Church, sat in stillness at his writing desk. The study was elegant, with walls of carved walnut and a vaulted ceiling that held centuries of history in its silence. Before him, a steaming cup of green tea gave off the faint aroma of steeped leaves. He reached for it with a hand marked by time and responsibility, by the countless burdens he had carried for the faithful. To the left of the cup rested a small wooden crucifix, simple yet profound. To the right, a thick red dossier, its black embossed title harsh against the crimson leather. LQBI Ministry Review, Minutes of Meeting. His eyes, lined by sleepless nights and long burdens, stared not at the words, but through them. They were the eyes of a man who had seen the pure joy of children receiving their first communion and the agonizing despair of priests falling into scandal, their vows shattered. He had sat in the balcony of joy and walked in the trenches of despair. And this morning, he listened not to a voice from outside, but to the quiet, brutal war within. The Church was divided. He had tried to heal it with prayer, with patience, with a hopeful vision of unity. He had hoped the young and the old could walk side by side, that mercy and doctrine could coexist without friction, like two rivers flowing into one. But last night's confrontation in the Great Hall had shattered that fragile hope. Harsh words, bitter accusations, and hot tears had fallen like thunder between his two most passionate cardinals, Luis Antonio Tagle and Robert Serra. Now the Pope waited for them again, but this time it would be different. The time for reconciliation had passed. Today would be a day of decision, a day that would echo through the history of the papacy itself. A gentle knock on the door broke the silence. Not loud, but certain. He knew that rhythm. It was Tagle. Leo XIV slowly rose, his white cassock falling to his feet, and moved toward the door. His fingers brushed against his silver beard as he composed his expression into one of calm, authoritative serenity. He opened the door and looked into the face of a man he considered a son, a man whose gentle spirit belied an iron will. Tagle stood there, slender and pale, his purple cassock perfectly pressed, but still carrying the wrinkle of unrest, of sleepless nights spent wrestling with his conscience. His eyes, always soft, were heavy today, glistening with a sorrow he struggled to contain. The silver rosary on his chest shimmered in the morning light, a quiet beacon. He bowed slightly and entered without a word, his gaze fixed on the floor. Behind him came Cardinal Robert Serra, his posture stiff, his gaze firm, almost unyielding. His red cassock was trimmed in black, a visual contradiction to Tagle's softer appearance, a stark declaration of his unwavering stance. He looked not at the Pope, but directly at Tagle, his eyes like cold iron, a silent challenge. The two men passed each other in silence, a silence that screamed more than any shouted words. Leo XIV gestured toward the two red velvet chairs before his desk. "Please, my brothers, sit." The three men settled in, and for a moment, none of them spoke. The ticking of the antique clock on the bookshelf became the loudest sound in the room, measuring out the agonizing seconds. The Pope took a sip of tea, its warmth grounding him. Then he looked at Tagle with sadness and resolve, a decision etched onto his features. "Last night," the Pope began, his voice low but firm, "I heard words that wounded the very soul of this church. I had hoped both of you could find a path forward, a shared mission to serve those who feel most distant from us. But I see now that this cannot go on. He placed a hand gently atop the red dossier, his fingers lingering there for a moment, as though he could feel the countless lives, the untold stories behind every page. I have decided, he continued slowly, each word a hammer blow, that all responsibilities regarding the Church's LGBTQ ministry will now rest solely with Cardinal Sarah. Tagle's body recoiled slightly, as though the words had struck him physically. His face paled, and he took a step back, his voice catching in his throat. "Holy Father, I didn't expect," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I have only ever wished to serve with mercy, with love." "I know," Leo said gently, his eyes filled with a profound sorrow, "and I honor your heart. But the division has grown too loud, too visible. We must preserve unity, even if it means sacrifice." Tagle opened his mouth to respond, but paused. His hand instinctively moved toward the crucifix on his chest, a desperate, silent plea for strength. He bowed his head, drawing deeply from an unseen well of grace. Then he looked up, tears glistening in his eyes. Unashamed. "Have you ever heard the voice of a transgender child cast out by her family?" he asked softly, his voice trembling with raw emotion. "I have. I held her as she wept, wondering if she was still loved by God. You may ask me to leave, but I cannot forget her voice or her tears." Sarah leaned forward, his tone firm but respectful, almost unyielding. "Compassion must not replace clarity. We must guide with truth, Holy Father. Mercy, yes, but not at the cost of doctrine, not at the cost of confusing the faithful." The Pope raised his hand to silence them, a quiet but commanding gesture. "Enough," he said, his voice quiet but sharp. "This is not a courtroom, nor is it a battlefield. This is the heart of the Church." He turned to Tagle, his gaze softening once more. "You are still my son, Luis, but I ask you to go to the places where you are most needed, among the poor, the forgotten, the periphery. Your voice still matters, just not at the center. Not now." Tagle stood trembling, his slender frame shaking with unspoken anguish. "Then I will go," he said, his voice barely a whisper, yet infused with an undeniable resolve. "But I will not be silent. I will carry the light to those who have only known darkness, and when I speak of God's mercy, it will not be theoretical. It will be the only warmth they know." He turned and walked toward the door, his steps heavy. At the threshold he paused, his hand on the cold brass. "Forgive me, Holy Father," he said, his voice strained but clear. "But if mercy has no place in the heart of the Church, then the Church will not survive the winter." And with that, he stepped into the corridor, leaving an agonizing silence in his wake. Pope Leo XIV remained seated, eyes closed, lips trembling. He had chosen unity, but at what cost? And who would bear the agonizing weight of that sacrifice? The morning sun spilled a little brighter through the window, illuminating the crucifix beside the teacup. The steam had faded, the tea had gone cold, and the church held its breath, waiting for the echo of a decision that had just ripped it in two. Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle stood in the corridor outside the papal study, his hands lightly folded in front of him. Though the morning light streamed through the tall Vatican windows, brushing across the stone with a quiet warmth, nothing about it felt warm. His breath was steady, but his heart was not. Behind the closed door he had just left stood the man he loved as a father, the man who had just stripped him of his ministry, of a part of his very soul. His cassock still bore the creases from last night's sleepless hours, a silent testament to his torment. The rosary at his chest shimmered faintly, a quiet contrast to the storm swirling inside him. He didn't cry. Not yet. There were no tears left after the private confrontation with the Pope, but his eyes, tired and dim, betrayed the profound silence of someone who had just been stripped not only of a ministry, but of a core part of his calling. his identity. He paused at a narrow overlook, his hand resting on the carved balustrade, the cold stone grounding him. Sun. He stared out, as if looking beyond the city, beyond the horizon, to the far-off places he had once visited. Manila, Nairobi, the Farda refugee camp. Places where the cries of the poor weren't just statistics, but names, faces, trembling hands reaching for a priest's blessing. Behind him, the door to the papal study clicked closed. The sound, subtle and clean, felt like the definitive end of something enormous, irreversible. He inhaled slowly, then exhaled, and whispered a single word: mercy. It wasn't a protest. It wasn't a complaint. It was a prayer. The kind that rises from the ground of a broken heart and climbs through the quiet like smoke, seeking the heavens. The silence of the corridor stretched around him. No one followed. No one spoke. He was utterly, agonizingly alone. He began to walk again, his steps quieter now. Each movement was deliberate, as though he was choosing not to crumble, not to shatter. At the end of the hall, a young priest stood waiting. It was Father Louis, his longtime aide, his loyal shadow. The younger man's eyes were glassy, red at the edges. He had heard the decision. Perhaps he had expected it. But like Tagle, he had hoped something else. Some miracle would happen. "Shall I prepare your quarters, Eminence?" Louis asked, his voice hushed. Tagle nodded gently. Yes. The small guest room. Nothing more. They moved together in silence until they reached the far wing where visiting cardinals sometimes stayed. The room they entered was simple, almost austere. Bare walls, a modest bed, a writing desk, and a small crucifix hung slightly askew above the doorway. No marble, no gilded lamps, just wood, linen, and the lingering scent of incense from the last occupant. Tagle sat on the edge of the bed. He didn't remove his cassock. He didn't loosen his collar. He simply sat, his hands resting on his knees, his eyes staring at the crucifix, as if seeking an answer in its silent form. He made his choice, he finally said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. Louis sat beside him, uncertain whether to respond, but the silence invited truth. He had to, the younger priest replied, his voice equally quiet. The noise had grown too loud. Tagle nodded, almost imperceptibly. But mercy was never the noise. It was the whisper beneath it. Louis hesitated, then reached into his satchel and handed the cardinal a small file. Notes Tagle had been working on for months. Proposals for LGBTQ pastoral care. Personal stories, testimonies, heartbreaking photos, anguished letters from families. A plan not of rigid ideology, but of profound accompaniment. "We still have the virtual Congress tomorrow," Louis said, a flicker of desperate hope in his eyes. "You have 5 minutes to speak." "They haven't taken that," Tagle smiled weakly, a ghost of his former warmth. 5 minutes can still hold eternity. He stood and moved toward the desk, opening the file and laying the documents out like precious relics, each page a testament to untold suffering. He picked up a photo, a thin, weeping girl in Manila, her short hair uneven, her eyes pleading, searching for something beyond judgment. He had met her just weeks after she was cast out by her parents for identifying as transgender. He remembered her voice, barely more than a whisper. "Father, does God still see me?" He had answered with tears in his eyes. "More than ever, child, especially now." He placed the photo beside a page filled with rough notes. "Have you set up the connection for the Congress?" he asked. Louis nodded. "Yes. A secure link through the camp's satellite. It should hold." Tagle reached for his worn Bible, flipping gently until he reached the Gospel of Mark, chapter 6. He read aloud in a whisper, his voice soft but resonant. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd and had compassion on them, because they were like sheep without a shepherd, and he began to teach them many things. He let his hand rest on the page. "That's all I've tried to do," he said. "Teach them. they are still his. That evening, after a simple dinner of bread and broth, Tagle walked the narrow gardens behind the guest quarters. The air was cool. A gentle breeze rustled the olive branches, as if sharing secrets. He paused beneath a fig tree, placing one hand on its rough bark, feeling the life within. Above him, the stars were just beginning to appear, pinpricks of distant hope. "Lord," he prayed aloud, his voice raw with emotion, "if I am meant to fade into the margins, then let those margins burn bright. If my voice is silenced at the center, let it echo louder on the outskirts. Do not let me forget the faces. Do not let me forget their names." He stayed there a long time, unmoving, as if rooted to the tree like a prophet waiting for a sign, for fire. When he returned to his room, Louis had already dimmed the lights. On the desk was a fresh candle, its tiny flame flickering with defiance, a stubborn refusal to extinguish. Tagle approached the desk, looked at the candle, then at the crucifix. He knelt before it, clasped his hands, and bowed his head. "I have been dismissed, but not defeated." His voice was soft, but steady, resolute. "I will go where they send me, and I will carry your name to those who have forgotten how to speak it." He rose, reached for his tablet, and began typing the title of his presentation. Mercy and Doctrine, a Journey to Welcome. 5 minutes. But in those 5 minutes, he would carry every broken soul he had ever touched. He would not try to win. He would try to witness. The early light of dawn stretched its pale arms across the Vatican sky, barely brushing the edge of the rooftops with hints of gold. The ancient stones beneath Cardinal Tagle's feet had known the weight of generations, of emperors and popes, saints and sinners. This morning, they carried only his. He walked alone through the corridor lined with pillars and silence, towards the private exit that would take him from the apostolic palace to the transport waiting below. No one had said goodbye. No guards saluted. No aides whispered words of consolation. Only Father Louis walked a few steps behind him, carrying the Cardinal's single black travel bag. It contained just a few items: a Bible, his well-worn breviary, a thumb drive with his presentation, and a purple stole folded carefully in between. Tagle's pace was steady but slow, like a man walking towards something he had not yet fully named, a new and terrifying chapter. He did not glance backward. The halls behind him had already closed like the pages of a book that would not be reopened, sealing off his past. He stopped near the bronze statue of St. Peter at the end of the passage, the one pilgrims often touched for blessing. The foot had long since been worn smooth by centuries of kisses and prayers. Tagle reached out and placed his hand gently on the statue's base. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The silence between him and the apostle was full, imbued with centuries of shared sacrifice and unyielding faith. At the end of the corridor, a small black car idled in the shadows. The driver waited respectfully, his cap tucked under his arm. Tagle turned to Louis, his voice calm, resolute. "Are we ready?" Louis nodded. "They've prepared the temporary quarters at the refugee mission. It's modest, but functional." "Good," Tagle replied, a faint smile touching his lips. "That's all I need." He entered the car without ceremony. The door clicked shut, muffling the world behind him, sealing him into his new, uncertain future. The driver pulled forward, the wheels whispering over the stone drive. From a window high above, a solitary nun watched the vehicle move away, her hands clasped in prayer, a silent sentinel. The Vatican walls receded into the background like the final frames of a fading film. Inside the car, Tagle sat in silence, his hands resting in his lap. He wasn't sure if he felt sadness or peace, perhaps both. The Lord, he knew, often allowed both to coexist, two sides of the same sacred coin. He reached into his coat and removed a small crucifix, a gift from a poor family in Manila years ago. It was carved from driftwood, simple and crude, but sacred, a constant reminder of his true calling. He held it against his chest and whispered quietly, "I will follow you, even here. As the city gave way to narrow streets and quieter neighborhoods, the clamor of Vatican life faded. Rome was waking, but not to the drama that had shaken its heart the day before. The people moved about their routines, opening cafes, sweeping doorsteps, calling out greetings. The world outside remained mostly unaware that a storm had broken within the highest echelons of the church. Tagle was dropped off at a discreet location, a small compound near the edge of the city that had been converted into a base for outreach missions. It was surrounded by gardens and gravel paths, with a modest chapel built of pale stone and a scattering of refugee tents nearby. Some children were already stirring near the entrance, their laughter breaking the morning stillness. A pure, innocent sound. One small boy ran barefoot toward him, then paused, unsure, his eyes wide with curiosity. Tagle bent down, smiling warmly. "Good morning," he said gently. The boy stepped closer and held out a wild flower he had picked. "For you, Padre." Tagle took it as if it were a crown, then placed it delicately on the windowsill near the chapel door. "Thank you. It's beautiful." Inside his new room, there was no desk carved with papal symbols, no chandelier, no antique tapestries, just a bed with a thin blanket, a simple table, and a wooden crucifix hung slightly askew above the window. The candle left beside the cot had burned most of the night, its wax pooling gently at the base, a testament to a quiet, solitary vigil. Tagle set his bag down and sat on the edge of the bed. The silence of the place was different from the silence of the Vatican. This one wasn't filled with tension, with the weight of expectation. It felt like a waiting space, a womb for new beginnings, for growth. He reached for his tablet, connected to the makeshift Wi-Fi, and opened the file for his presentation. Mercy and Doctrine, a journey to welcome. He reviewed each slide carefully, checking every caption, every photo. A picture of a transgender teenager from Manila, her eyes searching for something beyond judgment. A map of the refugee communities. A note about a boy from Ethiopia who had clutched his first rosary with trembling fingers, finding solace in its simple form. He adjusted nothing. These were not statistics or symbols. They were his parish, his flock. Father Lewis returned later with a tray of hot tea and some bread. "Local families insisted on baking it for you," he said, setting it down. Tagle smiled. "Tell them I am grateful." Then he stood, walked to the small altar in the corner, and lit the candle. Its tiny flame flickered against the stone wall. "This is where I begin again," he whispered, a solemn vow. That evening, after helping distribute food to the newly arrived families, Tagle returned to his room. He knelt at the altar, his head bowed, hands resting lightly on the edge of the wooden stand. "Lord Jesus," he prayed, his voice a soft murmur, "I am no longer at the center. I am no longer heard by the halls of power, but I am still yours, and I am still theirs." Outside, the sounds of the camp quieted. Mothers tucked children under patchwork blankets. A distant hymn hummed softly from someone's tent. The stars returned to their place in the sky, watching over this new, humble mission. Cardinal Tagle lay down, not with comfort, but with peace. He knew tomorrow would bring storms, accusations, perhaps more silencing. But here, in the forgotten corners of the world, where names didn't carry titles, the mission remained the same: to serve, to accompany, to love. And he would not stop. The screen flickered to life, illuminating Cardinal Tagle's face inside a modest room, far removed from the grandeur of Vatican halls. His backdrop was simple: a bare wall, a wooden cross, and the faint, almost ethereal sound of children playing outside the thin fabric of the refugee tent compound. He sat upright, wearing the same well-used cassock he had worn in the camps of Sudan, Syria, and Manila, a uniform of service, not of power. He had 5 minutes, and he knew every second mattered. Every word carried the weight of countless unseen lives. Across the world, hundreds of prelates, bishops, and Vatican observers joined the video synod. Some tuned in from palatial offices, surrounded by gilded furnishings. Others from rural diocesan outposts, simple and austere. They adjusted their earpieces, checked their lighting, and murmured greetings to colleagues as the moderator announced the next speaker. Your Eminence, Luis Antonio Cardinal Tagle, now has 5 minutes to share his pastoral reflections. There was a moment of silence before Tagle began, not out of hesitation, but out of reverence, a quiet moment to gather the strength of his conviction. He looked directly into the camera, his eyes clear and unwavering, and then he spoke, his voice carrying the echoes of the forgotten. My brothers and sisters, I do not speak today from a cathedral, nor from a conference hall. His words were a direct challenge to the very setting of the synod, a quiet rebellion against the pomp and circumstance. I speak from a camp where the walls are made of tarp and the floor is earth. I speak from a place where the gospel is not debated. It is begged for. The audience grew still. Even through digital screens, hearts leaned closer, drawn in by the raw authenticity of his words. Here in this camp, he continued, his voice steady, I have held the hands of young men and women who were abandoned by their families, their communities, even they believe by their church. Some of them are gay, some are transgender. All of them are searching, not for political arguments, but for the mercy of Christ. He lifted a small, tattered rosary, holding it up for the cameras to see. This was given to me yesterday by a young man named Farouk. He came to the refugee compound after escaping a militia that killed his brother for being different. Farouk had not spoken for 3 days. When he saw the crucifix around my neck, he whispered his first words, "Do you think he still loves me?" Tagle paused, letting the agonizing question hang in the air, echoing in the hearts of those listening. The silence on the call was deafening. Not even a cough from the global audience. I told him yes, Tagle continued, his voice filled with profound conviction. Not because I have the power to forgive, but because the crucified Christ does. The church must be the place where Farouk finds a home. Not just doctrine, but embrace. He clicked the next slide in his brief presentation. The screen displayed a simple chart: testimonies, outreach centers, and baptismal candidates from refugee camps, most of whom identified as LGBT+. I'm not suggesting we abandon our teachings, he said firmly, addressing the unspoken fears of many in the virtual room. I am begging us to embody them. Mercy is not a compromise. It is the very face of Jesus, and doctrine divorced from mercy is no longer recognizable as gospel. He looked directly into the lens now, his voice lowering, imbued with a quiet power that transcended his dismissed status. I know I have been reassigned. I know I no longer speak with authority from the center. But what do you think will happen next in Cardinal Tagle's 5-minute address? Will his plea for mercy resonate with the cardinals, or will it only further solidify the divide?